All right. Well, hi everyone. We'll get started now as people are rolling in, but you are at the We Did or Eat It event. And before we got started, I just wanted to give the Student Farm Club a little shout out because we planned this event, brought it together. So if you haven't heard of the Student Farm Club before, I put this collage together myself. It gives like a nice little summary of everything we're always up to. And I'm just so excited about the turnout we have tonight. I remember texting the exec group me when we hit 15 signups and we ended with about 160. So thank you all so much for being interested. But yeah, so my association with the Student Farm Club is that I'm the club program director and I'm a junior immunology and infectious disease major. And this semester, we just really wanted to have super engaging events, even though we're over Zoom. So we have talks like this, and then we have workshops. And then Eric, if you could go to the next slide. Here's where you can take a picture to stay updated on those other events we'll be having the rest of the semester. In 2 weeks, we're actually going to partner with Eco Action to have our first workshop, and we're going to make upcycled grocery bags out of t-shirts. So I think that'll be really, really awesome. Just as another way to show how we're just really trying to be engaging, even though we're over Zoom. And I really love the fact that we have students here, we have community members, we have staff, faculty, absolutely everyone. And one positive thing coming out of COVID is that we would never be able to do something like this beforehand and make it as accessible as it is. So with that, I'm going to hand the reins over to Eric and he can introduce himself.
All right. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Leslie, for having me. How's everybody doing out there? I see some thumbs, something, some reactions. There we go. Audrey's got, yeah, nice. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in on a chilly, snowy February evening. And hopefully you all are here because you're wanting to learn a little bit about foraging for plants, and we can't possibly do it justice in the time that we've allotted. But what we've kind of cooked up, I hope you'll agree, is an engaging program that I'll do some talking in it and talk a little bit about some case studies, if you will, of some plants that grow near or on the student farm. But we wanted to start out just by kind of getting a sense of the people and their knowledge in the groups. And so let's just kind of start with a little activity, if you all are game, as people are still filtering in. I'll just introduce myself a little bit further and then turn it over to Meg for us to kind of break out into some smaller groups, because I see people are still joining us. So we don't want them to kind of be in that netherworld. I am a faculty member here at Penn State, obviously, and I have kind of a dual program title. I work out at Shavers Creek Environmental Center. So if you're not familiar with Shavers Creek, now's the time to Google it and be aware that this is your environmental center, as we like to say. This is the university's opportunity to get involved with a operating nature center and a variety of programs that operate out of that center. But I am also an associate teaching professor in the College of Agricultural Sciences, where I do a lot of teaching around botany and plant identification and management, conservation. But also I do some research on what we call non-timber forest products, things that people harvest for food and medicine from the woods. And so we'll talk about one of those briefly this evening, but I'm going to keep my focus largely on weeds tonight. All right. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So Meg, if you wouldn't mind, we have a question that we want to pose to everybody to get our brain cells, our synapses firing, and get us all on the same page after a long day, maybe of Zooming or going out and playing in the snow. We want you to think about your interaction with plants today in the month of February. It may have been minimal, and it may have been only through consuming them. Okay? And so we'll start there. So take a look at these questions. and
Yeah.
we'll circle back in a couple of minutes.
So I'm about to send everyone into 5-person breakout rooms. And then we will have everyone be in the breakout room for about 2 minutes, and then I'll set a timer for 60 seconds to have everyone come back. Let's see. Want to make it enough rooms.
So as Meg is figuring out some of the logistics, just to, I know you all can read, but we want you to just think about these different plants that you've consumed perhaps today, and anything that you might know about them. Specifically, we're asking questions about, do you know their relatedness? Are they some sort of like melon or something? And where do they come from?
Your breakout room invitation has been sent. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that went smoothly. I kind of forgot that it would ask me how many breakout rooms to make and not how many people would be in each breakout room. So that's why that was a little slow for a second, but I know how many to make now, so the next one will be quicker.
All right, well, welcome back from the first session here. And let me just kind of reorient where we're going with this. So in my group, we were talking about some cereals, some beans, kale, and tea as something that people had consumed. And the general knowledge is don't know a whole lot about the plants and where they're from, but there was some knowledge about what families they might belong to or what they're related to. Anybody else have anything to share?
Well, we didn't know too much about whether or not our plants were native. We talked about grapes and rice and peanuts, and along with some leafy greens.
Okay.
But I mean, we had questions about whether or not peanuts were native.
It's a great question.
Are they?
They are not. I will share a slide in just a moment to kind of circle us around and tell us a little bit of an answer to this. But anybody else have anything that they brought in?
We had someone who had spice bush tea,
Oh, wow.
and that's
a walk.
native.
That's a walk on the wild side. Yeah.
That's right.
Anything else?
We eat a lot of poaceae.
A lot of poaceae, lots of grasses, lots of grains. Lex says quinoa. Oh, there's a good one. Okay. Exotic 20 years ago. Now it's like the thing. A pseudo grain, right? It belongs to actually a group of weeds, the lamb's quarters. And then Siobhan says the brassicas. So things like cabbages, broccoli, kale, so on. Dylan says avocados. Okay, avocados are somewhat of a native species if we want to dig into the deep south, into Mexico and so on. Dave says we plan to grow quinoa on Fayette campus this summer. Great. Yeah, it actually has a short, well, it requires a long growing season, but it requires cold nights actually to cause the grain to set. But it's a beautiful ornamental plant as well, and you can eat all of the leaves off it. Derek says nuts, or are they? Well, that's a good question, Derek, because the term nuts is kind of like the term vegetable. It's very loosely used. And so some nuts are native and some are not. Prin says bamboo shoots, and we do have some non-native bamboos that have been planted that people do actually manage, grow. Okay, so where are we going with this? Well, before we start talking about wild foods, the first thing we wanted to do is just get everybody thinking about the foods that they do consume and where they come from. And one of the fascinating things that we often don't think about is even if we have a so-called diverse diet, that is, we're consuming what we think is a lot of veggies and fruits, especially during the winter months, like right now, our palate and our diet really gets narrowed down. And even in, the abundant seasons of, let's say, July, August, September in a state like Pennsylvania, we really are looking at really just a couple of hundred of plants around the world, exactly about 354, according to some counts, that are widely used as food plants that can be pointed to as things that people consume as a garden plant or a cultivated plant. To put that into perspective, there are new species of flowering plants or seed plants being discovered every day, and that's primarily where we get our foods from, angiosperms. And we have 260,000 species on the planet Earth that have been discovered, right, named to science. And the fraction of what we consume is just a small part of that. And so just kind of want you to think about that. Another part of what I wanted you to think about was just a bit where those plants come from. And so this really gets to where we're going with wild foods and wild plant foraging, which is to say, what about all those plants that grow around you? When we look at where a lot of these species that are native to, we find that actually most of the things that you all say that you consume today aren't really represented here. So Derek mentioned nuts, and here we have pecans. Pecans are actually a type of hickory tree. Black walnut, to some degree, is cultivated, although it's mainly the English walnut that comes to us. That's the main foodstuff that we use. Things like wild rice. We all probably consume weekly rice of one form or another, but how many of us consume wild rice, right? And so you can see the list of plants are, maybe some of them pop out and you're like, I could have guessed cranberries, right? Because they're associated with Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and all that stuff, right? But I didn't know about blueberries, okay? And so, blueberries are North American native. Now, that being said, we have lots and lots of ornamentals and some medicinal plants and many fruits that are used for breeding stock in particular. And so they use them to graft other types of more desirable stock onto, for example, with grapes, plums and cherries and so on. So our palates are decidedly non-local, right? Most of these plants that come from the North American continent that we might forage for as crop species, most of us aren't even eating at this time. So that leads us to the second question. And if you didn't like breaking out, or if you didn't have enough time, this is your chance to shine in the second group. Okay? We're just going to cut you loose for a couple minutes. And this time we want you to think about, before we come back and talk about foraging, is what weeds do you recognize? If you have a garden, what kinds of weeds pop up in the garden? Or if you go for a hike, you don't necessarily have your own property or garden right now. If you go for a hike or walks somewhere, what do you recognize? And then what can you say about them, if anything? Do you know anything about what they're used for? Even if it's just kind of like, I'm not really sure about this, but I think. Okay, so we'll leave you with that. All right, how's everybody doing? How about some either call it out or put it in the chat, things that people talked about maybe in their groups. In our groups, we talked a lot about dandelion. We talked a little bit about garlic mustard. Lamb's quarters were mentioned. I see David is mentioning lamb's quarters again. Purslane was mentioned as well. And we also bridged this kind of deep topic, rabbit hole of what's the difference between an invasive species and a weed. Boy, that's a deep one. Grace, explosive club spores. I see that. I'm looking at people's chats here just to get a sense of what's coming in. Leslie says her group knew about a lot of different weeds and what they're used for. Excellent. Burdock, tea berries, pigweed is evil. Rebecca is saying she took my class, so she knows a lot of the invasive things that were introduced. Okay. All right. Well, good. I'm glad to hear that you all didn't go into some sort of strange netherworld of like, I don't know what to talk about. Actually, as it turns out, a lot of people have knowledge about some of the common weeds that grow around here, for example, and what they might be used for. And some of you are actually consuming them. So let's turn our attention to the program, if you will, which I'm calling A Tale of Three Weeds. It's a Charles Dickens novel that was never written. Okay. And the plants that I've chosen to talk about and engage you all around this evening are plants that I chose because I've spent enough time walking down near the student farm and along the bike paths there and the adjacent arboretum and so on to know that they grow there quite abundantly. And so they can be found and explored, if you will. You can look for them. They're all non-native weeds in the sense we're not necessarily going to call them invasive, although one does fall into that category. But they're things that have come over from other parts of the planet. They tend to follow disturbance. And so they're not some sort of rare plant that we would be concerned about sending you out harvesting a bunch of or even a little bit of. And finally, part of what we're trying to do here is get you to think about as you come back to campus or back to the area, some of the things that you could do to, physically isolate, get some exercise, and also contribute to some healthful eating. And so I would encourage you to think about these plants as you walk around and think about at least nibbling on them and seeing if there's any kind of, interest in consuming these things further. Now, I do want to give a shout out. Okay, feel free to give thumbs ups and stuff when you see something you like here. But I do want to give a shout out to, I see my Zoom bars showing. Thank you, Leslie. To early humans who figured out what we can eat and what we can't. All right, think about that. All these plants, even though there's just a handful of them that we consume, 350 or so species around the world that we consume fairly widely, it is important to recognize that these are plants that come down to us through generation after generation. Potatoes, tomatoes, all these things are plants that were selected by people and handed down to us. It's a little bit of a meme for sure here to say that this is exactly how people found out about the edibility of plants. And certainly in any kind of foraging, educational talk, we wouldn't necessarily want you to do this kind of trial and error, right? So don't go out and just start stuffing stuff in your mouth. Okay, and so there's a little bit of skill involved. Another meme here. Okay, I bet you didn't know that that coffee beans are native to Pennsylvania, and you can actually find them probably growing outside the deer fence down at the student farm. But there's a little bit of knowledge that's involved when we think about foraging, and we want to definitely think about where that knowledge comes from. And the first thing, we get a little academic to start us out, and then we're going to talk about this tale of three plants, is where this knowledge comes from. And by and large, it comes through human transmission, one way or another. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat box, so I'm going to pause just to see what's going on here. Slides are blocked by a large gray square.
Eric, I think your chat box itself might be open and showing up as a big gray thing.
How's that?
Better. Perfect.
Awesome.
Yep. Your Zoom bar at the top still, but I think we can read most of it.
So. I'm not sure why that's doing that, which is weird, right? Let's try just interrupting this show just for a moment and restarting it. Sometimes that's what it takes with Zoom, all right? How's that?
The bar is still there, but we can read everything.
All right. Super weird. Anyway, so I want to give another shout out to an early human, but not quite that old, who goes by the name of John Harshberger. And he used to be at the University of Pennsylvania And back in the late 1800s, from a scientific perspective, he coined this fancy term called ethnobotany, which is basically the study of people's relationships with plants. And so a lot of that has evolved into more applied kind of disciplines like horticulture and agronomy and so on. But it still paves the way for our understanding of how plants were used in the past. And often it was developed and talked about as a discipline that was focused on so-called Aboriginal or indigenous folks, but it really has evolved into a discipline that focuses on modern day folks as well. So how do people use plants in Pennsylvania at this point? Okay, and in ethnobotany, we have, of course, some scientific perspective to share about plants that were used for foods. And one of those things, if we turn to the North American continent, what would become the United States, is what did Native Americans consume? And when you look at the list of the most commonly consumed plants, you'll first of all note that there's almost 1,650 species that were used versus our 345 that are commonly used around the world, right? So much more diverse food palette being used here in North America. And when you look at some of these things, you recognize that they do eventually represent cultivars. So Zea mays being corn, right? But that was also a wild plant or a semi-domesticated plant in many parts of North America, like the Southwest. And so we have all these plants that were used, and some of them may be surprising. For example, if you know anything about chokecherry, and you think about chokecherry, and just the name alone might lead you to say, wait a second, something like chokecherry was the most commonly consumed plant. We have to think about where our knowledge comes from. And so when we look at all of the knowledge of these top 10 plants, it largely comes from the fact that most of ethnobotanical documentation was actually done in the Western United States. As I just mentioned, this gentleman, John Harshberger, really didn't coin and come up with this whole field of study until the late 1800s. So just over 100, 125 years ago. And so up until that time, it was maybe just people took it for granted, you could say. There was also a lot of cultural kind of arrogance, but people didn't necessarily care what Native Americans were consuming in the Eastern United States. And as a result, many of the species that we know about as important food plants in the North American continent actually come from the Western United States, or as you'll note, they're species like cattails, number 10, Typha latifolia, which is found all over the United States, so that we have some good documentation. And so a lot of our knowledge around the uses of plants and what you can do with them for food and medicine is gone, unfortunately, because we just didn't document it soon enough. There was a lot, again, of cultural arrogance that led to people just overlooking what a lot of the native folks in our region would have consumed outside of these cultivated plants like corn. And so in this day and age, while we have some ethnobotanical information to guide us, we also have to look to science. And increasingly, people join social media platforms such as the mushroom hunting groups, as you see here, that people are posting into, and maybe some of you belong to some of these foraging groups. Okay, but there's plenty of them out there, and they do represent kind of a modern way for people to kind of share at least an oral history of what they're consuming and what things are good for. But as we'll touch on as we go through the tale of three plants, we definitely also want to put up a cautionary flag that, you cannot read everything that you cannot believe everything that you read on the internet, right? And so we need to just kind of reassert that as we move forward. One of the first plants I'm going to talk about is actually this plant that this gentleman, who I've never met, is holding up. Neither of them I've never met, but they're talking about a plant that you can see, or you could see until the latest round of snow. And you'll see as the snow starts melting, kind of giving way through the snow. And it's a plant that, although it's not native to North America, it was brought here accidentally, it's believed, in this case, probably through contaminated seed of agricultural crops, for example. This is a plant that goes by the name of many wild things, wild onions, wild garlic, and so on. I'll talk a little more about some of the names in just a moment. But it was adopted by some Native American groups as a food plant, despite the fact that it was introduced clearly into North America within the last 300 years. And so here you can see three tribes, Native American tribes, and the fact that they had actually found and developed some practical experiential use around the plants. So this is the first plant that we want to talk about this evening. And as I kind of put these up, I'll be happy to see via thumbs, for example, if this looks familiar to anybody. And if anybody feels brave enough, I'll give a pregnant pause. And if anybody wants to chime in and suggest a name for this, I'll be happy to hear that. Anybody recognize this plant?
It looks like classic onion grass to me, but I might be off.
Onion grass. Yeah, onion grass. Does anybody have any different names for it? Maybe you recognize it and you're like, I don't call it onion grass. Pulling up the chat here. Spring onions, Siobhan says. Okay, this is a common plant that you'll see in a variety of different settings, sometimes in lawns, as you see here. It's the little tufted thing that's coming out of the grass. Sometimes it's found in forest lands and other kinds of areas that are disturbed. And this is known as Allium vineale. It's onion grass, and many people's kind of common parlance, also then recorded in field guides as wild garlic, wild onion, for example. And this is a little wild onion that we see quite commonly here in central Pennsylvania and really throughout the eastern United States, where all of the parts of the plant are edible. And so this is the same genus as our cultivated onions, the genus Allium, same genus as garlic, but a different species called vineale. This is something that is best harvested this time of year, especially when we start to head into the spring and you get this new growth. And it has a flavor that's reminiscent of chives. So think about this as something that is similar to a mild onion or garlic, at least in the tops, but it can be quite pungent if you eat the little bulbs. Okay, and they are little bulbs. So this is something that you notice more because you see these little tufts of grass. And then you go out and you look and there's a little bulb at the base of it that does swell up over the course of the springtime and get fatter and fatter, but it really is quite small. That's my thumb for scale. Okay. And so I'm going to reference, as I walk through my three examples here, wild and tame. Tame, in the world that I work in, many people would refer to many of the wild onions that are grown in gardens, for example, as a tame onion. So we're just going to kind of stick with the common parlance of wild versus tame. So this is the same genus that you would recognize in many of our cultivated onions, scallions, shallots, things of that nature. But it doesn't necessarily get the size and it hasn't been selected for any type of cultivation or mild flavoring. It does have a lot of the same properties associated with our wild onion or our cultivated onions and alliums, including antioxidants, which are very health promoting. Okay, and so this is what we're looking for this time of year. As the snow melts off, you'll see these little tufts of hair. This is a clonal plant, and so it multiplies over time. And from one little seed or little bulb, you get more of them. And so you can harvest the entire plant. You can kind of chop off the tops of them. And you would use them any way that you would use onions, and particularly, you know, if they're a very strong onion. So you would kind of start a little bit mild and get to know the flavor profile. Okay, and they can get quite thick, and here's why they call it grass, because it looks like a little grass. Okay, now, let me just point out that when you harvest this or you pull a leaf off of it this spring, it's going to differ from grass in the sense that it's got this little hollow cavity in it, and it's got oftentimes a little groove like a stalk of celery, like you can see in my finger there. So you're looking for a hollow stem with a little stalk that's got celery kind of groove on it. All right. And it's related to other things that people harvest here in Pennsylvania that are becoming very, very popular. And so I just want to kind of, by extension, acknowledge something that's known as a wild leek. So while we're talking about a wild onion on the right side, we have this thing called a wild leek or a ramp. And I have a couple of students, graduate students, who are working on the industry that has developed around wild leeks. So maybe some of you, as people who are interested in farming and gardening and foraging, are familiar with this particular plant. Again, show me a thumb. This is the plant for sale. If anybody's familiar with the East End Food Co-op in the western part of the state. It's also for sale in Central PA and Wegmans, which is what you can see on the right side. And this is a locally foraged product that you get from the forests of Pennsylvania, and many industries are developing here in Pennsylvania as a result of it, and elsewhere. You can see that's in North Carolina, Asheville, ramp salts, but the other products are produced right here in Pennsylvania. I'm seeing in chat, let me pause there. Beth says, there are festivals in West Virginia in the spring for ramps. So much fun. Indeed. So this is kind of a cultural icon as well. So we talk about a foraged food. This is an onion that's kind of gained a large following. It was harvested by Native Americans, but early European settlers recognized it as being very similar to something that you would harvest in Europe called bear garlic. And so here's a patch of ramps. In the springtime, it's one of the things that when it's abundant, as you can see here, can be harvested sustainably. And it's pretty recognizable. It, like onion grass, tends to produce most of its leaves before the canopy of the trees have kind of popped out. Okay. And again, a cautionary tale that people have actually been poisoned in Pennsylvania because they went out harvesting ramps and harvested skunk cabbage instead. And for those who know plants, you might kind of chuckle at that, you know, like how could one confuse skunk cabbage for ramps? But nonetheless, it's a cautionary tale. Here you can see on the left side that this is from Facebook, just from last year, that somebody's posting to see if this is ramps, right? Because it's easy if you don't do the homework to go out and think that, you know, well, it's got green leaves and it's kind of round and grows in a wet area. It must be what it is. And so skunk cabbage won't kill you, but it will sicken you. And so ramps are this allium that are really kind of emerging here in Pennsylvania in the region as this really popular food item. It's got a lot of the same flavor profiles as what we just talked about with onion grass. Only it's got maybe a little bit more biomass and a little more refined flavor, if you will. But it is a very different plant. It is native, it's slow growing, and most of the research today suggests that because of its slow growing nature, that you can really only harvest a given patch once every 10 years. And, you know, that's what do we mean by a patch, but it does point to the fact that, you know, there's a lot of conservation concern around a lot of our native plants that you might go out and forage for. And so recognizing things like onion grass, which are a non-native introduced plant that's a weed, pops up in people's lawns, grows in wild areas and like forests, and it's not really a problem to remove it because you're basically just weeding a weed. Is very different than going out and foraging for a slow-growing perennial plant that grows in very specific habitats and takes a long time to develop. Okay, so there's one tale. A second tale that I want to pivot to is a plant that you see growing underneath that kind of hedgerow of honeysuckle and box elder there, with the white flowers on top. Does anybody know what that is? Anybody put that in chat or speak to identification of that one?
Garlic mustard.
Okay, yeah, garlic mustard, excellent. And garlic mustard, native or non-native? Anybody know?
Is it non-native?
Yeah, non-native. And if you think back to the slide about this evening's talk, I said all three things would be non-native. So yes, non-native. This is garlic mustard. It's non-native to Pennsylvania. It's non-native to North America. It was introduced, as we'll talk about, a couple of 100 years ago as well. Maybe this leaf looks familiar. Okay, this is a biennial and it's in the mustard family. So we were just talking about the allium family, and now we're moving over to the mustard family. You'll note we're still consuming plants within a few families of what we've already talked about in our group breakouts. So really no new ground here, except we're eating on the wild side. So here we have a mustard, and it's a biennial. And so does anybody know what a biennial is here? Some of you that are at the student farm have to know what a biennial is, because many members of this family are biennials that we cultivate as annuals. Feel free to chime in. David says completes its life cycle in 2 years. Yes, correct. So we're looking at a plant that basically you plant it from seed the first year. It forms a rosette, as it's called, over the winter or in late season. And then the second year, or sometimes the first year, if you give it long enough growing season, it'll behave as an annual, but it's usually going to flower then the second year. And so many members of this family, the Brassicaceae, the mustard family, we actually cultivate. Okay? And we cultivate them for their first year production. And all of the members of this family have very distinctive kinds of flowers. And so when we talk about foraging, one of the things we're going to want to do is make sure that we understand some of the botanical families and some of the characteristics that are associated with what we might be foraging for, right? And so there are books out there, there are websites that talk about different patterns that we would look for in the plants. We'll just kind of point that out, that if you're going to forage, you have to know the plants, right, to be able to safely consume. And so we want to be able to pick out things like what are the patterns of the flowers, even if we're not going to consume the flowers. And so in the case of garlic mustard, this is a plant that can dominate areas, as you see here, and is often referred to, as it is in Pennsylvania, as being an invasive plant as a result. I teach right now a class, which a couple of students on this are in, on invasive plants. And this is a very tricky topic to kind of summarize. But the short story is we're talking about a plant that generally is not from here, okay, and starts to go crazy in the place that it's not from. And so in the case of garlic mustard, we're talking about a plant that's native to Europe and Asia. It was first reported in the US in 1868, so about 150 years ago in Long Island, New York. And it is thought that it was probably introduced as an edible plant, much like we would introduce kale or collard greens into our garden, and grown for its first year rosette. However, the plant did naturalize, and from there became much more aggressive in forested ecosystems. And now we consider it to be a problem species in forested ecosystems and can reduce diversity. And as you see on the right side, there are a number of different butterflies that are associated with things in the mustard family that can mistakenly use this plant as a source for rearing their caterpillars on. And yet the chemistry is not appropriate to the caterpillars, so the caterpillars die. And so there's this confusion that exists with our ecosystems. Furthermore, things like white-tailed deer won't touch it. And so as a result, many of our native species are eaten, and at the expense, these things kind of spread. So it brings up the point that foraging oftentimes can involve just kind of managing plant populations in a way that might be beneficial. So if you like foraging in the springtime for garlic mustard and cooking with it, you're actually doing something to help manage the landscape in many areas. Okay. It is worth noting that in its native range of Europe, it has all kinds of food web associations, but those associations and relationships are not present here in the United States at this time. Garlic mustard is an edible plant that goes way back in history. 6,000 years before present, in fact. And it is, as I said, believed that it's European settlers that brought the herb to the New World and introduced it into New York. And they used it not as something that you would put on a salad as a salad green, because it's too strong. It's very nutritional, but it's a very strong flavor profile. But they would actually use it as what we would call a pot hearn or a steamed green. So you would prepare it in some way before you would consume it, rather than just eating a big old plate full of it. That said, some people do mix it with salads in moderation, and particularly in the springtime when it's a little bit more mildly flavored ahead of flowering. But it's really best when it's used like, you would use kale as steamed or cooked into sauces or soups or something of that sort of thing. Now, a couple things to note. This is a feral plant. So people brought this here from Europe, and it became wild over time. Became feral, as we would say, like a feral pig. And so different localities are going to have different types of feral plants. And some of them may actually have a nicer texture, maybe less bitter, right? They might not bolt as quickly. So you might have these genetic kind of characteristics associated with local populations that make it a little bit better or more desirable than other populations. And so that's something to think about with weeds and foraging in general, is that sometimes where the plants grow make all the difference in terms of the quality of the product that you're going to consume. A plant that you are harvesting from a yard that's being trampled on and a dog is doing its business on and all that sort of stuff is going to be a very different quality than something that's growing in a nice rich compost soil. Final thing I want to note, and something that is another cautionary tale in our tour here, is that many of the wild plants, although they have relatives that are tame, they are wild and untamed, which makes them sometimes more nutritious, sometimes more flavorful, but also sometimes containing compounds that you might not want to consume much of. And in the case of garlic mustard, it has actually been found that there's cyanide present at different stages. I just want to point out that garlic mustard, while it was introduced as a leafy green, there is archaeological evidence that goes back, as I said, 6,000 years, that suggests that the seed actually was used as well. And if you think about seed, mustard seed, that comes from another member of this particular family. And so the spicy seeds here have been used for flavoring. And in fact, one of my former graduate students used to make pickles with garlic mustard seed. And here's the seeds then. They're gathered a little bit later in the spring, typically around June, July, somewhere in there. And again, this would be a way of maybe, even if plants go to flower, this is an invasive species. And so cutting the seed heads off and letting the seeds fall into a bag and using them that way would be, a double win-win, right? So you're getting a wild food product that you can play around with, but you're also controlling an invasive species. Now, wild mustards, as I mentioned, are used largely for their leafy greens. And when we think about tame mustards, we often think about the genus Brassica, call these things, oftentimes brassicaceous plants, because our ancestors started with one plant that was a wild mustard plant and turned it into a bunch of different things, which we now grow as different kind of phenotypes of the same species. And so wild mustard is oftentimes the same insofar that the common name is mustard and they have a spicy flavoring and they're related to one another. But as you'll notice in the case of garlic mustard, it's entirely a different genus altogether than brassicas. And so we want to pay attention to things like pesky scientific names when we're learning to forage for things. Things that are commonly called mustards would include many different plants, perhaps. Right? And as I mentioned, timing is oftentimes a really important thing, because in these wild plants, when we look at the chemistry of them, they're oftentimes more nutritional in some cases than what we would see in cultivated settings, because of where they're growing and their kind of ruderal nature. They're eking out a living and they're vigorous and they're taking up lots of kind of nutrients that are found in the forest understory and so on. But the reality is that they also are doing things physiologically. And a lot of those secondary metabolites that we would look at as being good for flavor and for medicinal and nutritional kinds of purposes also can create an upset stomach or may not be very healthful. And so in the case of garlic mustard, people have identified the fact that you can actually get very high levels of cyanide produced in young leaves. And so you have to steam them. And so knowing how to prepare wild plants is a very important thing. And so we think about that pesky term I just mentioned, ethnobotany, looking at how people prepared and have prepared these plants historically is often a guide to what we should be doing in the modern era. And so here's garlic mustard being first year little seedling, and this is what you would harvest. You wouldn't necessarily wait until the next year when this thing is about to flower. You would get it when it's nice and tender. The leaves are nice and young there. And again, you could consume a little bit, but for health purposes and really for palatability too, because it's quite bitter, you would steam it or put it in some sort of food to break down that cyanide. And when the plant starts to step up like this, it starts to kind of perk up. This is usually about late April, early May. This plant is going to seed. And so just like many of our crops in the family that we cultivate, like broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower, by the time it goes to seed, we start to get a very different profile of product that we may or may not want to consume. In the case of garlic mustard, it often gets really bitter, and so not necessarily good to consume at this stage. The final plant I want to mention is a tale of three plants, is one that you probably have seen as well. And I know it grows all through the valley near where the student farm is. Does anybody recognize the thing that has the white tops on it? A couple people said Queen Anne's lace. And Siobhan, I'm seeing your question from a moment ago. I'll circle back to it, but the answer in short is fermentation may very well help with the transformation of any compounds that are undesirable. Yeah, so this is Queen Anne's lace, also known as wild carrot. Anybody know that? All right, so this is actually the same species. Some botanists refer to it as a different subspecies. So below the level of species, this is Daucus carota. And so if you look at garden seed for carrots, maybe many of you are looking at your seed catalogs now, you'll notice it's Daucus carota. And many botanists will separate this out as sometimes subspecies sativa, which means edible, or other names throughout history. But basically, the story of this one is very much like we just mentioned with garlic mustard, which is that this is a carrot that was introduced by our ancestors a long time ago and became naturalized. Okay? And we could very well see in many areas that it's quite abundant, and yet we don't call it an invasive species in many cases. And so that gets into the politics of how we label things. We'll set that aside. But it is very much a weed. Okay? And let's see, Olivia's saying, I'm a counselor at a nature preserve summer camp, and we teach the kids about Queen Anne's lace. Yes, they love smelling the carroty roots. Awesome. I'll show you a picture of those in just a moment. So this is a feral carrot. And members of the carrot family, again, have their own pattern and characterized by having these oftentimes heavily divided leaves, what we call a compound leaf, and these distinct inflorescences that even the ancients recognized a couple thousand years ago, called these umbels. Okay? And so carrots and wild carrots and members of this family typically have this very ferny kind of leaf. Think about parsley and dill and cumin, lovage. All of these things belong to this family, right? And they all have kind of a very strong aroma, many of them producing seeds or parts that have oils impregnated in them. And so here we can see wild carrot in two forms. On the right, if you've grown carrots, and I'm assuming many of you have, since this is the Student Farm Club, you'll notice that that rosette of carrots, which is also a biennial once again, so it will produce a rosette if you grow it early enough in the season. So if you plant spring carrots, they will actually mature into a carrot that first year, and they may actually flower if you don't harvest them. And so if you plant carrots, some varieties need to be planted either as a spring carrot or a fall carrot, right? So here's the same situation as we have a biennial essentially that may actually flower the first year, or it'll flower the second year, but the first year looks a lot like a cultivated carrot in terms of its rosette. And when it flowers, here are the flowers. This is Queen Anne's lace as well. You can buy this as a seed to grow Queen Anne's lace. There's different ornamental colors. And you've got these little carrot family flowers that are 5-parted, that make up these small, what we call umbellets. And wild carrot, as Olivia just mentioned, does produce then in many soil types, again, the richer soil types yielding a better root, just like you would get with a typical carrot. This would be a nice example of a root. And if you dig it out, you'll notice, first of all, it's white. And you might say, well, I guess that's a bad root, or, something else, because you're used to seeing orange carrots, right? But as you'll notice in the picture that I have on the right, what has become all the rage in the gardening catalogs and at farmers markets, which is these multicolored carrots, is actually us going back to our roots, pun intended. I hope you all like that one. Us going back to our roots, because the first carrots that come from the Mediterranean, which is where carrots, Daucus carota, are from, they actually were white. And they started to select out the yellows and the purples first. And it wasn't until the 17 and 1800s in Europe that we started to select the ones that are rich in beta carotene, these orange ones. And so we maybe grew up associating carrots with having an orange flesh, but actually carrots come in a variety of different colors. And that's not a new trait, that's actually an old trait that is starting to come back again. Now, the challenge, if anybody, well, Olivia, you mentioned, if I put you on the spot, have you eaten these carrots? You said you dug them up and you've sniffed them. Have you ever eaten them?
I have not, and I'm glad that you brought this up, because I was going to ask at the end of the presentation if Queen Anne's lace is poisonous, because I was taught about Queen Anne's lace, but I never actually knew if it was poisonous or not. So I've never tried it.
Okay, yeah. Anybody else try wild carrot? Okay. Again, I would encourage you to try it. One of the things that you'll notice is it smells, both the foliage and the root, very much like a garden fresh carrot. Very pungent, very aromatic. Stick it in a car, it'll smell the car up like a carrot. Okay. But you'll also notice that there's a lack of sweetness and oftentimes much more fibrous kind of texture associated with it. Now, the fibrousness can be found in cultivated carrots too, depending on the texture of your soil. So you can kind of get rid of that by planting feral carrots in a compost or something. But it still doesn't have that sweetness that we've been selecting for in carrots. And it has a much more earthy and bitter flavor profile associated with it. All right, so I am just about ready to wrap up, and what I want to just share with you as we wind this down with our tail 3 plants is this a wild carrot, anyone? This is posted on social media. Does anybody tell?
I think that's that highly poisonous lookalike that I was asking you about.
Aha. Yeah, and you wouldn't be wrong. So this is poison hemlock, and this underscores the message that I want to kind of drive home this evening, which is foraging is fun, and it's really super interesting, and there's a lot of cool nutritional and medicinal benefits that come from it, and understandings about the natural world, but it also can veer into dangerous territory really quickly if you don't make sure that you're, investing the time in getting to know the plants and the characteristics of different plants and lookalikes and so on. In the case of poison hemlock, we also have a biennial that forms a rosette. In this case, however, you tend to see these red splotches on the base of the plant, which can be helpful. And if you're not aware, in the valley, Fox Hollow, what we call Fox Hollow of the student farm, in much of that meadow, there has been a explosion in this plant in recent years, just down on the other side of what used to be the National Guard station. And some colleagues have been doing some work around there, like Art Gover, to try and take care of it. But Derek's chiming in, yeah. So it's been really taking off in Central PA, and it's popping up near the student farm. And I want to just kind of leave you with this cautionary note. Again, purpose being that go out, see if you can find these 3 plants this springtime. You can find them all near the student farm. So go for a walk down that way, plenty of room to physically distance and so on. And see if you can notice this one as well. And notice that it is an extremely poisonous plant. In fact, it is one of our most poisonous plants. And it can basically stop respiratory function. It is the so-called hemlock that Socrates was forced to drink as part of his punishment for being too smart. Right? And so many of these things belong in very similar families. Everything we talked about this evening has a wild relative and something that we might recognize in the garden. But we also have different members of these families, being one perfectly safe to consume and the other being very poisonous and toxic. And so we want to basically make sure that when we step outside the garden gate and we're foraging, that we are definitely using our applied botanical skills. And if we're not sure, that we're seeking some additional information and expertise. The final thing I want to leave you with then is, as we've seen, and as Emerson reminds us, that in many cases, a weed is simply a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered, right? So in this case, we have 3 plants, 3 different kinds of uses associated with them, and 3 different botanical families and garden relatives that we can explore. With that, thanks for sticking around. And I had to throw in this final meme because it's exciting. I got my garden seeds all lined up here, ready to roll. Comments, questions? I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks for sticking with me, everyone. I see there's a couple of messages. Yes, Patty, Queen Anne has hairy legs. Ha! I didn't want to say that, but here's a good one. What do you mean by that, Patty?
Well, the stalk of the Queen Anne's, isn't that one of the ways that you can, one of the identifiers of Queen Anne's lace is that the stalk is hairy, as opposed to the hemlock, which has a smooth stalk?
You're absolutely correct. Yes. So at the base, I just showed you the poison hemlock where it has the little splotches. Many people learn that species as a mnemonic device. I did when I was an undergraduate. I learned it as an undergraduate in Idaho, which is where my undergraduate degree is from. And we were taught that those red splotches should remind you of blood. Because you're going to die and your heart's going to stop, right? Kind of thing, right? So it should remind you of your heart stopping. And so I hadn't heard the hairy legs with Queen Anne's lace, but what is being referenced is that instead of those red splotches in Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot, we have hairy legs or a hairy stem. Let's see, Siobhan, would you be willing to talk more about the breakdown of certain chemical components when fermenting something like garlic mustard? Well, that's a huge topic, and we could go down really big, nerdy rabbit holes. And there's people at this university who study this kind of stuff in gory detail. But the short story is, when we get certain families like the mustard family and even the onion family, is a lot of these things that we associate with their flavor profile and or their medicinal benefits, their healthful benefits. these things are kind of ephemeral products, right, in a physiological pathway. So think about garlic and onions. When you are sitting and looking at onions and they're sitting on a counter, you don't smell them and you don't have any reaction in terms of tears being promoted in your eye. But yet when you slice the onion and you damage it, you rupture the cells, and that causes an enzymatic process to go into motion that then creates this compound, this series of compounds, one of them known as allanase. But as a product of that pathway, you get that kind of reaction in your eye ducts, okay? And you get that strong smell and that sort of thing. And the same thing is true with the mustard family and garlic mustard, is that mustard oils have a very different kind of degradation process that goes on when you ferment them, right? When you take cabbage and you eat it fresh, and when you bake it in an oven to make some, stuffed cabbages, versus when you make fermented cabbage, right? You would, in each of those cases, be kind of bringing out different nutritional, different secondary metabolites and flavor kind of profiles of each of those different products by virtue of how well and how much you've processed it, right? So it's not always true that minimal processed foods are, the best. Sometimes things should be fermented or at least cooked, as we talked about with garlic mustard. Any other comments, questions?
I had another question about Queen Anne's lace. I also learned that the flower part of the Queen Anne's lace, one way you can identify it is it has a little, I guess, black dot in the middle, and the flowers are more rounded than the poison hemlock, which are look a little bit more blotchy and not as nicely circular. Would you say that's true?
That's a great question, a great observation. I would say that's mostly true. The little black dot that's often seen in the center of that big umbel in a Queen Anne's lace sometimes actually is different colors. In fact, some of the ornamentals that you can purchase from seed catalogs are kind of red in the center, for example, or they're entirely red. And so just like we saw in the poison hemlock with that purple pigmentation at the base, you see that strong pigment in many members of this family. And so you see it a lot as well in the flowers of some species. And so there is that strain of Queen Anne's lace that's been selected for. And furthermore, you can pretty much, maybe some of you have done this, you can pretty much make any Queen Anne's lace flowers, at least in the center, change color. Does anybody know what I'm going for there? Anybody done this? So what you do is you cut the inflorescence as the flowers are freshly open, and you take it and put it in a glass of water that has food coloring dissolved in it. And it'll take up the water like a straw, and the flowers, being really white, will actually translocate the food coloring into them. And so you can get the flowers to go blue and green and all kinds of things. So it's kind of one of those little fun things you can do with students and young kids and stuff like that. And so they have this ability to be kind of dyed, if you will. That works well with hydrangea. Okay, Beth says. Yeah, so you can do that. But otherwise, to get back to your question, sometimes you see that little splotching in the center and sometimes you don't, just depending on the lineage and the genetics and if people do it intentionally or not.
And just to clarify, they are not poisonous, the Queen Anne's lace version?
They are not poisonous, no. Now, this is kind of herbalism, 501, but it is worth noting that the seeds of Queen Anne's lace and wild carrot are thought to promote contractions of the womb, and so have been used as a form of birth control in the Middle Ages, for example. And so it's strongly advised that pregnant women don't go around drinking tea of carrot seed. because it's got pretty profound effects that have been even demonstrated in rat models and so on the uterus and so on. So yeah, there's like this contraindication, as we would say, about carrots, when to consume a lot of them and when not to consume them in different parts of them. You'll recognize that the seeds of carrots are no different in a sense than many of the seeds that we consume from the family, like dill seed and cumin seed, right? All these things have very strong aromatic oils in them that are quite pungent and may have a reaction on the body, either promoting digestion or something of that nature. So yeah, food, you know, the old saying, let thy food be thy medicine, right? In many cases.
For the people who are still here, I just want to say thank you again for coming and having interest. And I'm really excited about just everything the Student Farm Club has planned this semester. Like I said in the chat, this semester we're doing bi-weekly meetings / events, depending on how big they get, like this one. But our next event / meeting is in 2 weeks, and it'll be an upcycled eco bag. And you only need an old t-shirt that you want to upcycle and a pair of scissors, and we'll be working together to make grocery bags. And then we're partnering with Eco Action, and they'll be talking to us a little bit about food packaging waste while we do it during the dead time when everyone's working. So I think that'll be really, really cool as well. And thank you, Eric, for coming and speaking to us. It was all really awesome. Yeah, I was so happy with how all this went. So thank you.
Thanks for hanging in there, everyone. You all must be really interested in foraging. So it's been a pleasure.